So reading from Acts chapter 22 verse 30 through to 23 verse 11. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all conscience to this day." At this the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then he brought Paul and set him before them. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." We left Paul yesterday preparing to leave Ephesus. His first missionary journey had led many to come to faith. The Jerusalem Council in chapter 14 had endorsed him, and then his further journeys, Paul's message of faith alone in Christ alone, had transformed people. But everywhere he'd gone, he'd had opposition. There'd been a riot in Ephesus. But he travelled on, encouraging the believers, setting up local leaders in the churches. Then after leaving Ephesus, he goes back to Jerusalem, where Jewish opposition stirs up trouble, and he's arrested, chapter 21. Then, chapter 22, he tells his story, and he reminds them he is a Roman citizen, and so entitled to the rights of a Roman citizen, so trial by the emperor. And so we pick up this story at the end of chapter 2, with the commander of the guard taking Paul before the Sanhedrin to find out exactly what the charge is. So verse 30, Paul begins by telling the council that all he has done has been to fulfill his duty to God, and so he can stand with a clear conscience. He is being a good Jew. Now, verse 2. This winds the high priest Ananias up, who orders for Paul to be struck. Verse 3. Paul replies by alluding to Ezekiel chapter 13, saying God would strike Ananias, accusing the high priest of hypocrisy, of covering up a flimsy base. That's the idea of the whitewash wall. And he accuses the high priest of backing his own laws. Then verse 4, Paul is accused of insulting the high priest. And Paul defends himself, verse 6, by dividing the council. He uses the issue of the resurrection of the dead. Verse 8. The Pharisees believe in it, the Sadducees don't. And this causes uproar. And the commander fears for Paul's life, verse 10, and leads Paul away to safety. But if you like, Paul has shifted the debate away from himself onto a matter of theology. And they argue about theology, and so Paul is able to get away. And then verse 11 of our reading. It's a brilliant verse, isn't it? The following night, the Lord stood near Paul. In a way, Jesus is giving his approval to Paul. Jesus knows Paul's state. Alone, probably unsure about the future, and Jesus assures him he's following his strategy. You know, when we feel low and discouraged, we ought not to feel guilty about it, as if Christians shouldn't feel that way. We're not machines. We're humans. We have feelings, and we can be hurt by life. And God knows that. After all, he made us. Turn to God, and we can be assured he stands by our side. And then, again, verse 11, do you notice that despite all that's happened to Paul, all the disputes, the riots, the imprisonments, the beatings, God will not allow anything to stop his purposes. His will was for Paul to go to Rome, the heart of the empire. Evidence the church was on the move, that the message of Jesus was for all. And nothing was going to stop that. Even though today things may seem difficult for the church, everything that happened in Jerusalem to Paul was a step forward in bringing about God's purposes. And God stood by his chosen means, giving the courage and the strength. So today, if you feel low and discouraged, it's okay for Christians to feel like that. Get hold of God and don't let go of him. Then all things work for God's purposes. He will not let those purposes be thwarted, and he will stand by his means to achieve them. And if you're following God's will for your life, you're part of God's purposes, and he will not allow anything to thwart them or thwart you, no matter how you are feeling. So get hold of God and don't let go.